Hello, everybody. Scott Golden here, Golden Opportunities Coaching. Welcome to those of you who are new. Welcome back to those of you who are seasoned veterans of what we do around here. August is here, and hopefully that means we're going to get to a more regular release schedule. That's my goal, anyway. Like, subscribe, comment below if there's an audio you'd like to hear. Today we're going to talk about manipulative parents, about 10 things that I want to go through with everybody here about what manipulative parenting looks like, as I think unfortunately, as we enter an age where social phobias and social abnormalities become more commonplace in Western society, manipulative parents have become a major thing, especially the generation of parents who came up in the beginning of the me generation in the 80s, and there's just a lot of challenges there. So there's about 9 or 10 things I want to go forward with really quickly. These are things that I've seen over a 13-year career coaching nearly 15 or a little over 15,000 people. So manipulative parents will do the following things. Compare. So the idea that each child is individual, that each child is unique, that each child is special, is, for a manipulative parent, is and is not true. It's true in that they almost believe their child is one of the elite, but it's a reflection on them more than it is a reflection on the child themselves. As in, my child has to be special because I am special and I've been through more than anybody else, and that is placed onto the child. And so the comparison that's done is with other kids in the neighborhood, with siblings, with other kids at school or on sports teams, and the idea is my kid must be the best kid at blank, whatever blank is, whether it's academic or manners and behavior or to be an athlete, whatever have you. The idea being that the child being good at something is a reflection on the parent being a good parent, which obviously we know isn't true, as the child has to have a certain level of skill or knowledge or ability or discipline, desire, whatever have you, in order to be good at something. But a manipulative parent is always going to look for the best out of their child. Now, on the surface, that doesn't sound like a horrible thing, except when the manipulation is how they get to the quote best unquote. So that's one thing, and that comes down to the next thing on the list, which is parents who are manipulative are also codependent. Many times, and this is something that's not talked about a lot in society, codependent parents are almost reliving a second childhood through the action of having a child themselves. Many of them grew up with what they perceived to be harsher parents or parents who might have been abusive themselves. Actually, childhood abuse, on average, according to many in research, goes back 3 to 4 generations. So it's a cycle that's extremely hard to break. And so what we have is parents who are looking for validation through having children, as in, I am going to create this being, I am going to create this child, and the child has to love me because I created it. So they're not ready to be leaders. They're not ready to raise up children to be, healthy, balanced citizens. Instead, they're focused on getting something from having the child, whether it's praise, adoration, love, support, recognition from others, whatever it is. And there's a codependent relationship. Obviously, the child can't fend for his or herself, and so they have difficulty in growing to be independent, but the parent also is looking for something from the child. And so when the child has ideas that are different from the parent, there becomes automatically some discord and disconnect between the parent and the child, which then comes down to the third thing on our list, which is the use of guilt. So, and this is something that's going to be uncomfortable if you're easily triggered by thoughts that are outside the norm or just not a part of the groupthink mentality that is much of Western culture. Then you might want to skip ahead for a minute or two here. Guilt. A lot of parents have children to fill void within themselves. They're not ready for that responsibility. They're not ready for that commitment. They're not ready for that level of intensity, of sacrifice that's needed to be a good parent. And so what happens is the guilt that they carry, but they don't have a societal outlet to express. That is, I wish I didn't have this child. And I have talked to so many people over the years who, in a coaching environment, will say, hey, this is confidential, right? And of course, I say yes. And they'll say, I wish I never had kids. Um, of parents, I'd say that's 1 in 4, maybe something like that. Parents that are going through difficult times, but again, within the confines of regular society, that's not something that it's acceptable to say. And so now, what happens is that feeling, that emotion, that emotional response, especially if a parent is making a lot of sacrifices they wish they didn't have to make, and all of that is then projected onto the child. And when the child does something wrong or doesn't live up to the parents' expectations, which we'll get into expectations with our next point, but when the child doesn't live up to those expectations, immediately the parent will make the child feel guilty. If I didn't have you, then XYZ. If you weren't here, then I could have gone to school. If you weren't here, my relationship would have survived. If you weren't here, whatever it is. And what's sad is ultimately there are a good number of parents, both men and women, who feel that way. But because society doesn't give them an outlet for those emotions in a constructive, let's say, support group environment, hey, does anybody else feel this way? Without it being seen as societally unacceptable, then there's a higher likelihood that the level of abuse that comes from those feelings not being expressed is more likely to happen. And the victim in that situation is the child, who has now shifted to at least partially becoming the unwanted. And so that doesn't mean that the parent has no love for the child. And I've seen this. I love my child, but I still wish I hadn't had them, is a very common comment that I've heard from people that are struggling with financial issues related to children, or raising preteens and teenagers, or any number of things. Now, let's say they hold on to it and they never say it out loud. That can often lead to addiction. It can lead to a lot of things because they're trying to suppress that feeling. But then the other side of it, which is equally likely, is they're saying it out loud, and they're saying it in the direction of the child. And then the child ends up with fracturing of self-identity, because all of a sudden now they realize, hey, I'm a regret, I'm a mistake, I'm XYZ. And so, again, that cycle of potential addictive behavior or emotional and mental instability gets itself into another generation, all because we don't give people a way to live completely authentically when what, society is there. And again, let's say 50, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, the main focus was on the development of family that included children. Now in 2020, we're not in that same society, but people still live like we are in a lot of cases, and that creates a lot of challenges, especially in the western side of the world. Now, the next one is unreal goals. So, if a parent is manipulative because they have mental illness, or they have perfection complexes, or whatever they've got going on, they're going to put goals that are unrealistic upon their children. And those goals are, you've got to get it 100% every time you go on a test, and extra credit every time they give it, you got to take it. Or you've got to be the best on your sports team, or you've got to be the most friendly person in school, or you have to make friends with everybody, or you've got to be the leader in student government, or whatever, or you got to get ready for college. I actually spoke with a woman right when I got out of the nursing home I was in. I spoke with a woman who said, oh, I'm preparing my child for college. And I said, oh, that's wonderful. How long does she have before she's going to college? And I expected, a year, 2 years. And she said, oh, well, she's starting kindergarten. And I went, uh-oh, meep, back up. That's a little extreme. But again, there are a group of people who are trying to manipulate what they perceive to be the best outcome for their children, and they think that by having that structure of everything has to be perfect, that they're actually doing their children a favor when they're taking away their ability to grow and develop in a healthy manner, because they're not able to learn comfortably how to recover from making a misstep or a mistake, and that can create a whole lot of problems down the road for everyone involved. And again, the raising of children for a manipulative parent is very self centered. How does this affect me? How will I look? A lot of it is public perception centered too. So, a lot of times, the relationship with the child is almost as an accessory. This is a way that I can get compliments. This is a way that I can get adoration. This is a way I can get um, a pat on the back. And I remind people all the time a pat on the back is only 18 inches away from a kick in the butt. But anyhow, so it's a way to get a pat on the back. It's a way to get adoration, and that self-centeredness can lead to things like Munchausen syndrome, or labeling one child as having emotional or mental issues to get sympathy, and all sorts of other things. But that self-centered nature in parenting, which ultimately comes down to I don't feel loved, so I create this thing to love me, and then when it doesn't love me exactly perfectly, I have to create reasons that that's true so that I can feel better, which ties into the next thing on our list, which is cruelty or abuse. Manipulative parents are being abusive just by being manipulative, but they are more likely to be physically, emotionally, mentally, or sexually abusive, or a combination of all above. This cruelty comes from the fact that, again, going back to an earlier point, deep down they regret the action of having children, but there's no outlet for them to express this, and so they take it out on the child instead. This is especially true for people that have severe mental illnesses or comorbid mental illnesses, meaning that they're dealing with multiple mental illnesses at the same time. This can cause a lot of problems, friction, and challenges. And so the next thing in this is no freedom. Children are not given freedom because if they express an identity that is separate from the parent feels less important. And a lot of parents who are extremely anxious about how their children turn out as a reflection of themselves will limit the child's ability to make decisions that aren't in alignment with what the parent believes. And so a lot of times what happens, and when I work with specifically millennials right now, which I don't know the age breakdown, but I'd say under 30, so 18 to 30, there's a whole bunch of people who are struggling because they were never given the freedom to make decisions. Spoke with a person a couple of months ago who literally thought it was normal to have his mother go to, and when I say go to, I mean sit in on, not actually take him to the building, but go to a job interview with him, and was completely flummoxed when the interviewer said that that was not something that the company could accommodate, and literally called me for a coaching session because they really wanted the job, but they weren't ready to go on a job interview on their own, only to find out that they had had a very narcissistic experience with parenthood, and so they had no idea how to make that big a decision on their own. And it's really sad because there's a whole segment of the population which is coming up now that don't have any idea how to do that don't understand the boundaries of having had the development of freedom be a part of childhood and keep growing and keep growing and keep growing until they reach adulthood. There is a segment of the population that's never happened for. A lot of that comes down to the action of the next thing on our list, which is gaslighting. So gaslighting is saying that things that happened actually didn't, and making a person question their own lucidity, sanity, or retelling of events. Gaslighting is done to take attention away from negative behavior performed and executed by the parent in order to get their way. It's a manipulative tactic usually used by people with Machiavellian or narcissistic personality traits, although it can be used by other forms of abusers and people that are just extremely anxious or insecure. But a parent who is manipulative will gaslight their own children so that they gain more authority. And they do this also through the next thing on the list, which is understanding that they don't need to apply boundaries to their children, and the children don't have right to apply boundaries to them. So again, if the self-identity of the parent is directly interlocked with the success of the child, parents will become what we now know in Western culture as helicopter parents who are in part of every decision, which means there's no boundaries, which means ultimately that the decision making processes of the younger person are impaired because they don't understand how to make a decision without that confirmation and that validation, and the pressure that comes with making decisions then in that scenario also will create anxiety and depression and all sorts of other unfriendly emotional results. But for the parent, they believe that having boundaries will make their child more likely to fail, which is something they can't cope with because their self identity is so wrapped up in the existence of the success of the child. And sadly, this doesn't just happen in the millennial generation. This happens in almost every generation, especially the generation I'd say from, let's call it 35 to 50, if we round that off. And I don't know what the demographic of that would be called, but I deal with people in that demographic a lot who are like, well, my mom or my dad never encouraged me to have boundaries, and so now I get with partners that don't have boundaries, and many of these people are going through first or second divorces, and they're wondering why they continue to attract unhealthy relationships, and they have to relearn the act of setting boundaries because it was never encouraged as children. So if you're going through this as a person, please know you're not alone. The last one is conditions on love. Unconditional love is a controversial topic for many people. Some believe it exists. Some believe it exists only from a deity or higher power, and some believe that people can execute unconditional love on a continual basis. I am a person that believes the human being can, in fact, execute unconditional love. However, it's extremely rare because it means that one has to completely accept circumstances they do not like from within a person whom they love and let things play out and practice active detachment. And many people have not been taught how to practice active detachment while still loving a person, that is allowing them to make mistakes and stumble sometimes while still loving them and completely being invested in them as a person. So a manipulative parent will do the opposite of that, place many conditions, numerous conditions, upon the child, saying, I'll only love you if you do A, B, C, D, which ultimately then makes love something to be earned, which then gives into the personality archetype of the overgiver, which people have to unlearn, usually through counseling or working with a pastor or coach or some other person, so they can see the pattern of overgiving being something that can lead to future manipulation, not only from their parents, but from partners, and then be repeated many times in relationships with their own children. So that's a challenge in and of itself. But anyway, hopefully this has been helpful for you. Again, if there's a topic you'd like to see covered, please feel free to reach out in the comments below, and we'll get that done within a couple of days usually. In any event, keep your feet on the ground, your mind in the moment. Till next time, everybody.